Welcome back to Philosophy 1101, Problems of Philosophy at the University of Connecticut. Today will be our second discussion of ethics, and in this discussion we'll talk primarily about challenges to and extensions of utilitarianism, and we'll have a discussion of the doctrine of relativism as well. So I'd like you to think for a moment about what a utilitarian, for example John Stuart Mill, would have to say about the ethical status of non-human animals. Remember that the utilitarian doctrine had said that the right action is one that maximizes the overall, so to speak, global amount of happiness, minimizes the amount of suffering and pain, etc. And there's nothing in that definition that makes any specific reference to the happiness or unhappiness, pleasure, pain, etc. of members of our own species. So it would seem that if you can perform an action that will increase the well-being of non-human animals, in particular those non-human animals that are capable of feeling happiness, that are capable of feeling pleasure, and other types of valuable states of mind, then that's a strike in favor, that's a consideration in favor of that action. So too, if there's a way of avoiding an action that would be likely to produce suffering on the part of non-human animals, the utilitarian will say, you've got a reason for doing so, that is avoiding that action rather than causing that suffering. So we might distinguish between, on the one hand, an absolute prohibition against, for example, eating meat, or engaging in animal testing, or for that matter just torturing non-human animals on the one hand, or on the other hand a general rule of thumb that says because non-human animals are capable of suffering, it's therefore best to avoid causing them pain, and therefore better to go out of your way, do whatever you can to increase their general well-being. So now, I want you to think about the question whether or not the utilitarian will have an absolute prohibition or just a general directive in favor of, including within the circle of ethically significant beings, non-human animals, rather than just members of our own species. I'd like you to reflect on that, and hopefully that will be a basis for discussion for you in this course. One topic that I think you might find of interest is what's known as the Great Ape Project, in which philosophers, others concerned with non-human animals, particularly other great apes besides ourselves, in particular chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, and orangutans, proponents of the Great Ape Project have been arguing that the United Nations should develop not just a Declaration of Human Rights, which it already has, but have a declaration on great apes. The idea being that these are creatures that have many characteristics similar to those of members of our own species, and that they should be considered part of a community of equals with members of our own species, and we should do everything we can to avoid torture, to avoid using them for entertainment. We should respect their land rights, for example. So the Great Ape Project aims to include in the circle of non-human animals fellow great apes, which are capable of fairly sophisticated forms of cognition, certain kinds of self-awareness. It certainly seems that they're capable of higher order emotions of the sort that we've discussed before, for example, and that's reason for thinking that great apes should be part of that circle as well. But again, one might wonder whether or not the utilitarian will say great apes should be considered as having inalienable rights in the way that we often think that human beings do, or whether or not because they're capable of suffering, feeling pain, pleasure, etc., they should be considered in the way that we consider all possible consequences with regard to the pleasure or pain-making implications of our actions. Now, another thing I want you to consider when discussing utilitarianism is the nature of the pleasures, happiness, etc., that somebody can experience in response to situations around her or him. So if we're talking about, from the utilitarian point of view, the project of maximizing well-being or maximizing pleasure or maximizing happiness, where in our discussion of Mill in our last lecture we noticed that even if pleasure and happiness are both in some sense in the same general area or category, nevertheless happiness is going to be broader and more inclusive because some pleasures will be higher or some forms of happiness will be more sophisticated than others. But what about those forms of pleasure that somebody might take in the downfall or suffering or unhappiness or other kind of pain in someone else? So suppose in our utilitarian calculation we're deciding when figuring out what to do, we notice that some people take a great deal of pleasure in watching others suffer. whether it be real life people or people that are just virtual in cartoons or video games, something of the kind. Should those pleasures that the so-called wicked pleasures, should those wicked pleasures be ones that we should acknowledge as part of our utilitarian calculation? This notion, the German word is Schadenfreude, that is to say, taking pleasure in somebody else's well-being. That word has made its way into English to some extent as well. Should Schadenfreude types of pleasures be considered as part of our calculation? One feels that there's something immoral about taking pleasure in somebody else's suffering, but nevertheless it's pleasure all the same for those people who experience these things. So should that count as a consideration, a factor, part of our philosophic calculus as it were, or not? Likewise, imagine somebody is a sadist and they take great pleasure in either real or imaginary torturing of someone else. Suppose, just for the imaginary case, suppose somebody sets up a virtual reality kind of system in which they have a very vivid experience in which they're causing somebody else a great deal of suffering. They apparently, the person who has the virtual experience of causing this, seem to get a great deal of pleasure out of that. Is that something that we should count as part of our utilitarian calculation or not? I don't want to try to settle that question, but it's a question I'd like you to consider. If you feel that there's something immoral about taking pleasure in somebody else's, whether that person is fictional or real, somebody else's suffering, then I want to suggest that you may be tapping into an ethical sensibility that perhaps is not going to be captured fully by the utilitarian perspective. That is to say, if you think that, no, it's wrong to allow the sadist, even the virtual reality sadist, to have pleasures that count in the philosophic calculus, then what you're implicitly admitting, I think, is that there are, in your view, limitations on the utilitarian method for determining what is right or what is wrong.